Hey guys, it's Mike here, and recently on my channel, I discussed the topic of what happened in the original timeline of Dragon Ball Z and the Dragon Ball franchise as a whole, which you can see over on my channel if you haven't seen yet. This is going to be in many ways a follow-up to that, in which I'm going to be taking a look and examining another timeline, one that we never really saw play out on screen in the franchise, and that would be the unseen timeline. So when everything started, of course, there was the original timeline. However, what happened to the initial timeline that the original Trunks went back in time and tried to ensure that it would have a brighter future than the dark one that he had seen in his own time? Well, let me get into that right now. And as I mentioned before, you could check out my video about what happened in the original timeline, as well as a number of other videos that are currently on my channel, just by clicking on the channel button down below, or of course on the end screen of this video. But let's get into the very first part of this, which is the initial explanation of the existence of this timeline, which is when Cell showed up and explained it. So part is actually a little bit ironic considering what happens in the unseen timeline, but I'll be getting into that momentarily. So basically, as for the existence of the unseen timeline, we were first told this in the Dragon Ball story when Cell emerged from underneath the ground and started to absorb everyone in Ginger Town. Piccolo, of course, showed up to try and fight him, and what ended up happening? Well, Cell explained when Piccolo was faking that he was weakened, that his whole backstory, essentially. He states that when he woke up in the future, he started to absorb human life. However, they weren't enough for him to become perfect. He needed to be able to merge with, to absorb Dr. Gero's other creations of Android 17 and 18 to become perfect. But when I was activated in the future, numbers 17 and 18 were gone. I don't know how, defeated by Trunks perhaps. But luckily, Trunks had the time machine. I killed him, took it, and came here looking for numbers 17 and 18. So the Trunks that Cell killed is the original Trunks. That is the Trunks that went back in time to save another timeline. This is something that is confirmed because of the fact that what happens here is that Cell explains that Trunks had already programmed the time machine to go to the year that Cell ended up in, and Piccolo speculates that Trunks probably wanted to come tell them that he was able to destroy the androids in the future. So in that particular timeline, Trunks had already gone back in time to another timeline that we didn't see and proceeded to save it, seemingly. So that is the unseen timeline. But how do events actually play out within that timeline? Well, they play out just like everything that we had seen in the main storyline up to a certain point. In that particular story, what ended up happening was that Goku had his entire journey with Bulma and all of his friends, gathering them up along the way, eventually making his way to Namek after he had learned about his Saiyan heritage and they needed the Dragon Balls because of the attack of the Saiyans. He fought and defeated Frieza, and then Frieza showed up on the Earth. And just like in the original, or just like in the main timeline that we see taking place, what ended up happening here? Well, in the original timeline, in the History of Trunks timeline, what happened was that Goku actually showed up and killed the androids. And I actually have a video over on my channel that you could check out in which I explain how future Goku actually was able to defeat King Cold and Frieza in that timeline. So you could definitely check that out. But in terms of that, we were never actually shown on screen in the anime or manga. However, the fight that we actually were shown was that future Trunks showed up. The original Trunks in this case being in the original timeline, and everything played out the exact same way that we see right here to our knowledge, which is that the original Trunks went back in time to this unseen timeline. He proceeded to fight Frieza, cut him up into pieces, blow him away, and then kill his father, King Cold. And then, of course, he would go on to meet Goku, tell him about everything that occurred, give him the heart virus medication after he had arrived on the Earth, and everything basically played out the exact same way that we see it on screen. Eventually, what would happen is that androids 19 and 20 would show up ready to fight the Z Fighters. However, things started to change around that time, in particular around this point, as we could see right here, where the Z Fighters had been defeated by the androids. Krillin finds out exactly what was going on there. And then they explain that they're doing this all for a game, that they want to try and find Goku themselves because that'll make things a lot more fun, and they fly off into the distance. At this point, Piccolo goes to try and unite with Kami so that he could defeat the androids. However, after this point, everything is kind of uncharted territory because of the fact that the reason why Kami and Piccolo unite is actually not because of the androids. Because as you could see right here, what Kami ends up saying when Piccolo wants to unite with him to defeat them is that to see if these androids are really harmful to the Earth. He wants to wait because, as you can see right here, Piccolo says, look what they did to us, and Kami says, you started the fight, and even then, they didn't kill you. Yes, and I heard that these androids are slightly different from those that Future Trunks knew. And so basically, he wanted to wait at this point to see how everything played out with the androids and not in turn fuse with Piccolo. It was only when we end up seeing the emergence of another character, with that being Cell, as you could see right here, that Kami had actually witnessed everything that was going on. As you could see right here, he was watching everything take place, and then in turn let Piccolo unite with him so that they could fight the even greater growing threat of Cell that we see here. However, in the unseen timeline, none of this actually happened. In the unseen timeline, Cell never went back in time. Now, a lot of people may be confused by that because you could see right here what ends up happening is that Cell, when he's explaining everything to Piccolo, I gotta love how many manga panels I have up here. No wonder it takes me forever to find this stuff. Cell explains that he killed the original Trunks, who had gone back in time and created the second timeline, the unseen timeline, and then stole his time machine to go back in time. So a lot of people think that Cell must have gone back to the unseen timeline and then came to the main one. However, that's actually not true. Cell circumvented everything because of the fact that he actually went back in time to a year before Trunks arrived. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, as we could see right here, Trunks actually explains when he finds the time machine what happened. He says that the time machine came from 3 years further in the future from when he left, and it came to about 4 years ago, which is 1 year before Trunks originally traveled back in time, as he says right here. What that means is that Cell actually circumvented the unseen timeline by going back further than Trunks did and created the main timeline. He also created this alternate variant of future Trunks that we see throughout the story, who is the one that defeated King Cold and Frieza in the main timeline. Because the fact that he went back to before that Trunks would have arrived, thus in turn being in the past of that future time traveler, and then in turn creating that whole other branching reality where Trunks encountered Cell and then learned about him and went back in the future with that knowledge and made it so that he could kill Cell and stop that whole loop, as we could see right here, from occurring. Hopefully your minds haven't turned to scrambled eggs right now. I know that this is very complex. It is time travel after all. So because Cell never came back in time to the unseen timeline, that means that everything that Cell's involvement leads to in turn would have caused other things to not occur. So like, for example, what wouldn't have happened? Well, one of the big things that may not have happened has to do with Kami and Piccolo, as I said before, merging into the nameless Namekian, fighting against Cell, and then eventually not just fighting against Cell, but also the fight between Piccolo and Android 17. It's entirely possible that this fight never played out. However, let's say that the fight did in fact play out. Again, I do have another video over on my channel in which I talked about if Piccolo fought against Android 17, who would have won if Cell never interrupted that? That's one of those great interrupted fights that we never really saw a conclusion to. So I went in depth with that in that video as well. However, the thing is that this fight may have never happened at all because Piccolo may have never actually merged with Kami, which would have then in turn led to him being able to battle against 17, because up until the point that 17 maybe would have theoretically fought against Goku or somebody, or proven that he was a massive threat to the planet, like the future variants of him in 18, then Kami never would have fused with Piccolo and allowed this entire situation to play out. Now, furthermore, another thing that may not have happened is that the characters entered into the hyperbolic time chamber or room of spirit and time. Now, why is that exactly? Well, one of the reasons for that is because of the fact that, again, Cell is one of the people who prompted this. It wasn't just that Trunks and Vegeta learned of the power of the androids firsthand and how strong they were, but instead Vegeta saw just how strong Piccolo was and how he was far more powerful, as you could see right here, than Vegeta as a Super Saiyan, which is another thing that led to Vegeta, losing more of his pride and wanting to train. And then he also finds out about Cell, and then he gets to this point where he's saying the Super Saiyan is supposed to be the most powerful being in existence, and here they're outdoing us left and right. It's maddening. Don't you agree, Kakarot? And speaking of Kakarot, speaking of Goku right here, during everything taking place, as Goku says right when he wakes up, which I'll pull up right now, he actually says that he heard everyone talking in his dream and he has a good idea of what's going on. Something terrible happened again, and that he knows that if Vegeta isn't able to win, he can't either. And so he's going to transcend the Super Saiyan. He's going to, as he says momentarily, he's going to go into a room where he could spend a year and train to his absolute maximum within it in a single day on the outside, which is the Room of Spirit and Time, the Time Chamber, as many people would like to call it. At this point, he goes and he talks to Vegeta, who's training mentally in order to try and see beyond Super Saiyan, and then train with him in the hyperbolic time chamber, or rather have him train with Trunks and then have Gohan train with Goku. However, the thing is that, as we're seeing right here, this may have never actually happened. Instead, it's possible that Goku and Vegeta maybe went about doing something different in order to defeat the androids, or maybe Trunks is the one who defeated the androids instead, and the way that he would have done that is when him and Krillin actually went to Dr. Gero's laboratory. And once there, this is where Trunks found the blueprints for the androids. And he was able to, in turn, wipe out the cell that was still in here along with Krillin in order to stop it from being born in the main timeline and then in turn having to face that threat again. Of course, this is also what led to Krillin being able to utilize the remote shutdown device. This was something that Bulma had created along with Dr. Brief after getting those schematics so that they would be able to take out the androids. Now, it's heavily speculated that this is the reason why Trunks was actually able to defeat the androids in the future. And this is something that Cell even speculates on when he and Piccolo were speaking, as you could see momentarily. He actually explains that they were defeated by Trunks somehow, and then he speculates on, not too long after that, he may have utilized the remote shutdown device in order to do that. So as a result, it's entirely possible that what many fans have speculated on over the years, that Trunks learned about the remote shutdown devices in the past, used them to kill the androids in the unseen timeline, and then went to his future and killed those ones that way. However, a problem that arises is the main reason why Trunks went to the laboratory and found the blueprints that let them build that remote shutdown device is because of the fact that, again, Cell showed up in the past. So he was alerted to the fact that there was another bunker underneath the laboratory, which is where Cell was, and that's what led him to go to that laboratory in order to not only find the blueprints, but primarily to wipe out Cell before he was ever born in this timeline. However, that's not something that ever could have possibly happened if Cell didn't arrive in the past, because Trunks never would have learned of it. Instead, as I talked about in another video, wow, so many plugs I'm doing today, guys, I know, where I discussed how Trunks defeated the original androids that you could see right about here. It's possible that actually what happened is that Trunks went into the hyperbolic time chamber with Vegeta after all, and thus in turn he and the other Z fighters were able to become powerful enough to defeat the androids and Cell, because the thing is that they still would have needed to train hypothetically to defeat the androids, especially if they didn't know about this other room underneath the lab where they can get the remote shutdown device. So as a result, it's possible that they trained in here, Trunks went to the future and defeated his androids, and then maybe Cell caught him off guard when he was in his base form and killed him, because it's not likely that Trunks, even after training for, let's say, a day in the time chamber, would have been able to kill Cell in just his base form alone if he's completely caught off guard. So that's definitely a possibility as well. Either way, it's likely that Vegeta and Goku would have continued to train after this point, and wouldn't have wanted Trunks to even defeat the androids using the shutdown device, because it would completely go against their codes and what they wanted to do. However, after that point, the androids had been destroyed, so a question becomes, what exactly happened after this point? Well, despite the fact that there are different variations of materials that state that Cell actually did have a Cell Games at some point in the Unseen Timeline, that never would have made any sense because, again, as I mentioned, Cell never went back. However, that does leave open the question of what about the Cell in the Unseen Timeline, because the fact that Trunks never would have known about Cell, and thus as a result, he never would have killed Cell when he was still incubating in the pod with the supercomputer in the past, and thus as a result, Cell would still even exist in that unseen timeline, as I talked about in yet another video, which is about villains that are still alive in other timelines, and I talked about Cell, as you could see right here. I also talked about why Cell is the best villain. Check that out. There's so many cards I could put in one video, guys. So the fact of the matter is that Cell likely is still, incubating in that pod, and eventually would be able to get out, assuming that nobody ever found the underground bunker and destroyed it. Which means that, Cell eventually will wake up in the unseen timeline and seek to absorb Android 1718, who either are alive after they were defeated by the Z fighters who decided to spare them using, brute force, or who have been destroyed. However, in the unseen timeline, if they've been destroyed, then this means that Cell will never be able to become perfect that way, and just absorbing a bunch of people is never going to be enough to propel him to his perfection. So he might be able to train, he might be even vastly more powerful just in his imperfect state, because the fact that, for all we know, Majin Buu, Babidi, and Deborah show up, and then Dr. Gero's little drone sample data from them, sample data from Beerus, and then the other, beings that show up on the planet over time. I mean, imagine Cell with all of those, divine beings and their cells absorbed into him as well. That would only be something that, even without his perfection, would be insanely powerful. And then for all we know, maybe Cell could, steal a time ring. He could find a way to go to one of the other timelines, absorb those androids, or maybe he could find the Dragon Balls and wish back Android 17 and 18 and then absorb them and become perfect. So there's a lot of possibilities for what could have happened. However, one of the issues is that if Cell never arrived in the original timeline, then that means all the characters would be weaker, because even though Goku, Gohan, Trunks, and Vegeta could train in the time chamber, they probably wouldn't have trained anywhere near as long or as intensely to defeat the androids comparative to Cell. So as a result, that means that they would all be weaker, and Goku would no doubt still be alive, because the fact that he wouldn't have needed to sacrifice himself in order to defeat Cell, in order to at least make Cell not destroy the planet. And as a result, he would still be alive in the 7 years later when theoretically Babidi and Majin Buu show up. Babidi and Deborah show up to try and get the energy for Majin Buu. So that opens up a whole can of worms. Would the Z Fighters even be able to defeat Deborah and everyone else if he's comparable to Cell? And that means, that maybe they would have had a much more difficult time, as we saw with Trunks and Dragon Ball Super. It really leaves open a lot of questions, because let's say that happens, and maybe in this case they would be able to stop Majin Buu from being resurrected because of the fact that they wouldn't have ever needed to have that entire situation play out, because Goku and Vegeta still would have been on the same planet for many years. I'm sure they would have fought at least once during that time period. Goku no doubt would have won, because he was always ahead of Vegeta without the Majin boost and stuff like that at that point in the series. And as a result, I'm sure that Vegeta probably would have become more civilized, and maybe he would have teamed up alongside Goku, not really needing the Majin boost at that point, and the other Z fighters, and defeated the minions of Babidi before Majin Buu is awakened. I'm sure that Supreme Kai would still show up and maybe go to Goku's house or something and, try and get them to be recruited to help against Buu. But I feel like things would turn out a lot differently in that case. And, it's a whole question of what would happen next, especially going to Dragon Ball Super. I figure that things would probably play out relatively the same way. Characters would be weaker, but they would still get significant training. And, if that difference in strength at that point in the series would really make a difference, well, I'm sure it would play out maybe in a much darker scenario if that's the case, where maybe Universe 7 would be completely erased, assuming that they lose in the Tournament to Power, or, maybe Universe 6 and 7 with swap places. So many things that are left open when it comes to that. So that is what happened in the Unseen timeline. Things played out pretty much exactly the same way up until when Cell would have arrived, which means that because Cell wasn't there, characters would have played things out differently. They might have defeated the androids using the remote shutdown device, or at least the characters who defeated them wouldn't be as powerful as they were in the main timeline, because obviously they wouldn't also be needing to train to defeat Cell. And, there's a number of other possibilities that could have happened with the Buu saga, with things in Dragon Ball Super. So let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Do you have any idea what you think might have happened? It's a question of whether or not Toei will ever play with this. Maybe Cell will come back again, this time as the real Cell, even though he would be the unseen Cell, I guess you could say, not Cell Max, where all he does is scream for no reason, which I also talked about in my video where I reviewed Dragon Ball Super Superhero on my channel. Check that out. Also, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
And you better subscribe!